Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. We complete this recent, slightly interrupted series on Sagehood today with an unapologetic, see what I did there, comparison of various forms of Eastern transcendental metaphysics and Edenity's own Sagehood dharma. Topics include Edenity's assertion of what we call the pre-dual versus what is traditionally known as the non-dual, a key difference between awakening in men and women, and a possible future for enlightenment dharma that goes deeper than going upstream to only mind. Thanks for listening, and if you're on YouTube, for watching. Greetings and welcome forward, everybody. And what was the phrase, the hackneyed phrase I was wanting to remember for this episode? We now continue our regularly scheduled programming, which right. Dates me. I don't think they say that anymore.
No, that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
So we're going to go back to, in a nonlinear fashion, back to the Sagehood. And it's very difficult, listeners, to deliver content on Sagehood because the nature, as you start to feel into it, it's like the content starts to circle a drain and only silence wants to be said. And
yes,
so it's hard to talk about it. You just sort of want to stare out the window and be it.
Sure.
But we will be talking about these things.
Yeah, that's the embodiment of it, which can't be spoken. But so you're stuck in context and what it means for the human condition and, you know, all those kinds of things, the context, but the content, like you say, what can you do?
What can you? But before we go into Sage Land, there was a hangover question that I believe you posed. You posed this last time. And that question was, why not call ourselves prophets? And that's an intriguing question. This is, if you didn't listen to that episode, that was the apology / not apology about for arrogance. So, and right. Of course, right there, I mean, calling yourself a prophet. I don't know who the last person was to do that, or anybody who does that. I mean, that's sort of a taboo word now, because to call yourself a prophet is incredibly arrogant seeming.
Absolutely, yeah. As I think I mentioned at the end of last podcast, a new friend with a Zen background asked me if, because I could always feel divine being feel me in this really intimate way and hear its presence, voice, blah, 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 did anyone ever refer to me as a prophet? And no one ever did, but the question roiled inside me, and I needed to process it a bit to find some peace with it. And it was interesting because I think I mentioned this last time. I felt just in a meta way that resisting it was not the answer, but to embrace it in a way where I could not push against it or care whether or not anyone called me that. And so I went in it with it and processed it with a couple of people's help, including Breeze. And so for me, that when it's a noun, prophet, it's one meaning, but
sure,
which means to prophesize. Well, I prophesize when I can see ahead of events or look into someone's probable near future or past, and so I can prophesize. But the noun prophet becomes put yourself above others.
It's an identity
title.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so both Bree and someone else helped me. Would that title, though, if it upsets me in some way, I'm still resisting it, you see? And so the question is whether or not someone says, well, you know, you're a prophet. I said, well, if that's how it lives in you, you know, more power to you. But I can't really get any traction as an identity as a prophet. It's got too many connotations of arrogance and superiority and differentness.
Yeah, and then, you know, from the Sagehood angle, you would say about that, you know, the disidentification challenge would be like, well, are you always a prophet? Like, no,
Right.
obviously not. No one is
Right.
always funny or always smart or always prophesizing. So how
That's right.
true is a noun identity, wrapping for that? So,
Yeah,
um,
right. Most of the context for it is sainthood more than the sage.
yeah.
The prophet is more of a religious, spiritual, divine kind of orientation, and it also means someone chosen by God. It infers you're chosen by God for some utility or usefulness, and God doesn't choose. A divine being doesn't choose anyone over anyone else. So which is why it certainly doesn't have a pet race. The
Or chooses
chosen,
sides in wars, like is always
right?
shown in.
Exactly. I
Yes.
mean, imagine what would happen to conservative Judaism if that actually was absorbed.
Oh,
That they're
yes.
not. That there's no chosen people.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, talk about an identity
Mm-hmm.
that's been how long? Like 3,000 years old, maybe 2,500, 3,000
I,
years
I
old.
don't know. I mean, like, and I'm certainly not going by memory here, but I have an intuitive curiosity of if have we actually done a significant treatment on identification, how the soul doesn't need identity. I don't know if we actually we've covered it ancillarily, um,
Yes, ancillarily. That's right.
but I don't
Uh,
think we've done that head on.
let's do that next time.
Okay.
Let's talk about identity, and we'll give a little teaser here that for me, every time I see the word identity, I see id entity. Uh,
I didn't. That's great. Mm-hmm.
Freud's, ego, id, and superego. So I see id entity, and so it's inherently in some way a toxic thing relative to our bigger being consciousness. So not toxic, but it can be held on, related to toxically,
Yeah, I
and
just
that's
did a
what we're
search in my
talking about.
giant index of all of our episodes, and the word identity only appears once, where I just wrote that we're going to talk about that next time. So, yeah, we haven't done that. It's
All right,
especially
let's.
it's super important now because of identity politics
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all of this, like, well, I'm a Democrat or I'm a MAGA person, and
mm,
therefore critical thinking is second to my identity, or effective policy is second to the identity, and that's what is causing huge conflict. Because
yeah,
when there was less over identification with parties, there could
right.
be actual discourse, and now there's just
Yes,
fighting, and that's what identities
yeah,
do. Yeah.
yeah, and of course now we have to add with Robert F. Kennedy in Trump's fold, we have to add Maha, make America healthy again. He uses that phraseology or that initialism
Oh,
now.
is really? I
Maha.
didn't know that.
Yeah. Maha.
But now
Yeah.
he's endorsed Trump, presumably
Yes.
to get a seat on his cabinet, or at least
Yeah.
that's the
Um,
rumor.
what a,
So much
well,
for him
there's
being a
another,
critical thinker.
oh boy. Yeah. We could say so much about that. That's actually has spiritual context too, but
Yeah.
let's stay on our track here, maybe another time.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so where should we start with Sagehood today? Or continue, rather?
yeah. Well, I'd like to start by kind of summing up and then see where the summing up takes us with your input too, Joseph. Um, of course, all the not from traditional sources, the non-dual dynamical bandwidth of consciousness or not consciousness, however you want to say it, began in Hinduism, where attachment and identification with the uh, normal cultural ethos gave you a false identity that was responsible for all your suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That attachments to, interestingly enough, your personal identity is what causes suffering. So the original swamis and ascetics wanted to displace any attachments to the normal cultural ethos of India, for example, where you were attached to family, attached to money, attached to happiness, attached to family, whatever it was. So that's why the ascetics went into the woods and
Yeah,
fasted
that's
and
renunciation. That's where that came from. Mm-hmm.
right renunciation type pictures. And eventually, Advaita Vedanta, which codified some of the more esoteric aspects of those first ascetics before the Buddha, but especially after the Buddha, they coded it such that the only identity that is an impersonal, non-dual being, a being that has no self-reflectiveness to itself, but acts as some sort of a backdrop or context that allows personalness to arise out of it. Now, it's always been an interesting question. How did personalness arise out of impersonalness? Is always a funny treatment. The Buddhists have their five skandhas, but they bail out after the first skandha, which is another whole story I'd rather not critique so much. But
there's not a compelling explanation for how that happens.
No, the first skandha actually says at some point in time, a part of impersonality cleaved off impersonality. That's basically what the first skandha of the five skandhas say. And there's no causation possible that would ever allow impersonal to cleave off a personal, because it is essential impersonalness, right?
Yes.
So
and then
it's really,
while all the metaphysics explanation and critical thinking was useful before that moment, at that moment, it becomes your mind just obfuscating and you're stuck. And it's sort of like, it's the equivalent of how like the Amish and Mennonites decided, well, more Amish because Mennonites use cars and cell phones. But like the Amish decided that the exact right amount of technology is what existed at 1885. And after that, then it's not okay. But technology prior to that was okay.
Critical thinking, 101.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the interesting thing about the whole traditional tale of enlightenment is based on how the original India swamis saw attachment to normal life was all dualistic. It is this and not that, that and not this. And your attachment, if you go to the bare bones through all the cultural ethos and your attachments, the basic governing dynamic is dualism. You dualize in the a normal waking consciousness state, and that's the one. And if you overattach to that dualistic you, then you're in out of touch with quote unquote literally the base reality of realities. Mm-hmm. So once they attack that connection was made, then what really is the mechanism that of attachment, and that is attaching to duality. And by that means, they were trying to detach from their identity as normal Indian people, to something that reflected the base reality of realities, which was not personal, not dualistic, undualistic.
But prior to Siddhartha Gautama, the alternative to dualism was what we would in Edenity we call unilism, right? Oneness, consciousness, universality. Isn't that where they were leaning to?
Well, it depended on the sect. I think there were 3 or 4 faded into history sects of Indian esotericism prior to the Buddha. And so I think that's true. I remember a long time ago studying that stuff, and I've forgotten, of course. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, what they called unilism was really impersonality.
Uh-huh.
You see, and this is where they stuck with it. They wouldn't call it unilism because for them a unity of some kind is still a something, not a no thing. See.
And isn't that what they call Brahman or Brahma?
Yeah, Brahma. Yeah. Yes, Brahma. Yeah. Absolutely. And when they say that Atman is Brahman, the individual tile is the mosaic.
Yeah.
The individual Atman.
The drop of water is the ocean. And the ultimate state of consciousness is to return to that.
Yes, where you lose all attachments to personal dualistic identity, and the drop rejoins the impersonal. But again, how the ocean of how the drop came to be arise out of an endless ocean is always an interesting
And that we
question.
contrast with Edenity's one of the three core principles, that the self is spiritual of and to itself, not as a pass through, or it's only spiritual because it can return to the ocean, or because it's, originally from the ocean, but there's essential spirituality to it. That's where it's different than Hinduism and lots of other things.
Yeah, and so thanks. Yeah, that's right. A good summary there to that piece. And so then along comes the historical Siddhartha, and he comes to do to uh, Hinduism what Yeshua came to do to Judaism, reform it and move it to a clearer, more pure application of consciousness. So he still non-dualism was not in the so much in the language of either the swamis. It was impersonal or Brahman, right?
Yeah, right.
But he was the first to come along and say that only the mind creates a noun of self. Only a noun, or only a dualistic mind would create a noun out of self when it is an ongoing flow of river, like we talked the first two. And so, in that sense, he didn't use the word advaya or non-dualism, like we said before, either. It was just impermanent, such that you couldn't at any moment make a noun out of a river flowing. And his enlightened state was a flow thing, a verb, not an empty self, not a noun self, but something in between, an impermanently arising mystery.
And then related to
So,
that, one of my favorite and I think key distinctions, because he's quoted often as having said that life is suffering, which is a mistranslation. He said that life is dukkha, which is the unsatisfactoriness of content and dualistic based happiness. Basically, that's exactly what it was really about. That the content is unsatisfactory. It leaves you always wanting more, planning your next meal or orgasm or whatever. You can never get enough because it's the content itself. There's no meaning actually inherent in it.
No, and it's a never ending, it's a bucket with a hole in the bottom in that way. So the abstraction that sort of fits it in another way of saying it is that it's not that suffering is what you want to get rid of, but the suffering over your suffering.
Right, which is, there's a key fork in the road. It's not about transcending all of duality to get rid of your suffering, but anchoring meaning in something deeper, bigger, and a higher order of magnitude than the content.
Yeah. In fact, just yesterday, day before yesterday, Joseph, I was doing a reading for a woman, and she had said she spent her whole life trying to enlighten. And I asked her what was the point of that for her personally? What did she want to get out of it? And she said, "Well,
that's that's the brutal question. I've seen you ask that question so many times, all sincere, and it's such a trap."
and I just went silent, waited for her to answer, and she thought a moment. She goes, "Well, the obvious one, to get rid of my suffering."
Boom, boom, boom.
Exactly. Yeah. So I had to proceed to offer, just in case she wanted to hang up now and not pay me for the reading, that was not the point of enlightenment. It has never been the point of enlightenment, according to Buddha, who codified the next level clarities about enlightenment, the first one to start the game going.
I heard Adyashanti talking about this once, and he was joking about if he wanted to really sell a lot of books, he would write a book called What Enlightenment Can Do for You.
Yes.
He was
trying
to make the point of, like, you have to come from its perspective and see you, not only from your perspective. And on the way to awakening, you have to, toward the end, you have to lose the seeker, and the seeker is the one who's trying to, because the seeker will get you to a certain place, and then you'll get stuck because you're still trying to get something from it for you, and the you that is wanting that is exactly what is in the way of awakening. And then you get stuck there.
Yeah. And so in that sense, we've been there's a whole, how can I say, a density associated. For example, the world is really soaking wet in the thought forms of religious philosophy. The planet literally is stuffed with it in the human in the collective human consciousness, and also clogged by centuries and centuries, millennia of pre-dual, or what we call pre-dual or non-dual teachings also. So that's a really difficult, when you get that sense of that clogged up collective human consciousness, it's really hard to offset it with a new paradigm that we're talking about here, Edenity, that makes a completely different take on it. So
yeah, every time I hear someone say, "Oh, I love gardening. That's my meditation," or "blah blah blah is my meditation," it's just like that. Those are the places where you feel that clog, because there's this a priori cultural sort of. I love the soaking wet metaphor. There's just like, think about the hundreds of millions of people who think they know what meditation is. And it's not just a little bit off. Like it's paradigmatically completely screwed up and co-opted by emotional protectors so that they can try to get their cake and eat it too. And it's a dead end. It's tragic.
Yeah. Well, and even a proponent, Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, he would say it would be clogged by conditioning.
Yes.
And we would just go one step further into content and say you've got emoto spiritual distortions, ideational paradigms that are just not resonant with reality. So that, in fact, that's what what drew me to Jiddu, first of all, years and years ago, is he said his whole life was living into the question is, what is an unconditioned human being?
Yeah, that's a cool question to pursue.
Yeah, and he knew well enough, he was clear enough to live into it as a question without an answer.
Yeah.
Because an answer would be so apt to be attached to, and you've got to live the question in Krishnamurti's teaching to ever get even a scintilla. I'm being dated using the word scintilla of understanding or experience of what enlightenment is purported to be.
And
right?
just even that right there, the concept of sitting with a question and seeing what it does to your experience is extremely difficult to get many people to do. Even after you tell them, I'm going to ask you a question, see what that does to your experience, or here's this question, sit with it for a few days. They just start throwing answers at you instead of looking at their experience.
Yeah, and that's, someone, the only way you can tell someone actually gets what you just said is to go silent. Yeah, because it takes a contemplative effort to live a question. What does that mean? Because the mind, it doesn't have a box for it. It doesn't have a dualistic box, right? Yeah. So what happened here then, of course, let's continue the timeline as we try to tie this together and see what Edenity's final verdicts are in terms of definitions and practice, what practice involves. And that is that the word non-duality did not actually really come about, as we've said before, until Buddhism moved to China as Chan Buddhism, and then to Japan as Zen Buddhism. And there over Confucius stuff in China influences, and some other influences in the societal collectivism of Japan.
So Gautama didn't turn it into a thing, which makes sense. He wouldn't have given it a name.
No, he would not. He never used the word advaya, as we said, which is no thingness, right? So that's when the non-dual became the goal. But it's not a thing, but it's the goal to attain a state of non-dual consciousness, which is an oxymoron. You can't have non-dual consciousness and have consciousness.
Right. That's the what enlightenment can do for me paradigm right there.
Subtract the you who wants a benefit, right?
Yeah, because when you're enlightened, you feel good all the time, right? That's surely what it means, right? I'm sure we've covered that earlier, but ask 1,000 people what it's like to be enlightened, and 99% of them will say something like that.
Yeah. And even to the now where it gets really sticky, something we've noted before in other podcasts, but let's include it for completion here, is that modern neurobiology would completely agree with Zen Buddhism, uh, that the self, to which the noun of I, is illusorily created by the way the brain operates and cathects, not experience so much, but dualizes experience by its very nature. That's the most they can say. So when that came started coming out in the 70s with some advances in neurobiology, then modern neurobiologists became the best BFFs of Buddhism,
Hmm.
because they both arrived at with an atheistic lights out at death, which is the same as saying, another way of saying drop in the ocean, where you lose personal consciousness forever. Um,
Uh-huh.
the same
Hmm.
thing. So when they became best buds since the 70s, now we've got an additional congestion in the consciousness of humanity, that's blocks wets down, or like you're trying to light a fire in a campground, but it's everything's
Yeah.
soaking wet
And
with a
plus, most
new
of these
paradigm.
Western scientists would have grown up in something vaguely Judeo Christian. So they would
Yes.
have an unconscious pushback against those ideas, which is what
Yeah.
causes Westerners to fall for the seductiveness of Eastern thought because it's so different, and while not
Yeah.
realizing that it's just as distorted and just in more subtle ways.
Oh, beautifully said. The fairy tales of religionism are so blatant and so contradictory, that an intelligent person can't abide them. A critical thinker certainly can't. But people who have a hunger for something greater than human conceptual consciousness, that's again, like you say, they're attracted to a quasi spiritual east, which in a sense, Advaita Vedanta tries to maintain a spirituality to it, because there is an impersonal being inside of which we all arise. But the I is a temporary mayfly in that, and it's never repeated. So
A
no
mayfly. Nice.
reincarnation. Yeah,
Hmm.
just it lives for a day, a lifetime, and then that's it. So in that sense, what Edenity steps in and says, uh, instead of getting hung up on dualism and non-dualism, we inquire as to what is pre-thought, what is pre-I, what is pre, where out of what does it arise, right? And so in that sense, we're not we that's why we use the word pre-dual and not trans-dual or non-dual, because it's sort of like living into the question kind of dynamic. When you intuitively or contemplatively try to seek that which is prior to you, the seeker, that's a really finely lasered kind of focus that is far more to the point of what we're trying to do here. If you're trying to transcend your your slavery to dualism, if you look at what does it arise out of, and the more you seek what your consciousness or duality or my I as a noun arises out of, the more blank you get. And there's, I think one Buddhist sect said there's like 82 layers to that contemplative sinking into from duality to non-duality. So it's got a lot of layers and bandwidths. But to seek that which precedes the I or precedes a dualistic focus, that's far more lasered a seeking. And as of course we say in our paradigm, that the whole point of what we call meditation is to find the seeker, right?
You know,
What
what
it,
just hits me, I wonder if this is, I've played with that, but I'm just remembering in my own sagehood path, one of the turning points for me in meditation was when I would get lost in thought, as you do when you meditate. And then when I would realize I was lost in thought, I had this practice of like, how did I realize I was lost in thought?
Yes.
And I would go looking for the me that realized I was lost in thought. Because if you're
Hmm.
lost in thought, then presumably you'd
Hmm.
be in there forever. If I am lost in thought, then what is
Sure.
that which gets me up out of that? And it seems
Hmm.
to be sort of in the direction of the priorness.
Yes. Yeah.
That's why
It's
that works. It's not quite
yeah,
as
and
direct, but it's in the neighborhood, right?
I'm right with you. That's what I came out of my own event with is when I saw people when I did satsang for a couple of months, whatever that was. What they were doing was trying to get out of it rather than see out of which it
Yeah.
comes.
Get into it.
And
Yeah.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's literally transdual or meta dual, we could say now. But they're going that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Up
but
and
but
out.
the other way, as the Buddha didn't say it directly, but he taught that inner observation. He didn't go out to transdualize. He wanted to really know the nature of consciousness in an inner way. So that's exactly right. You seek the seeker and find that it can't be found.
Mm-hmm.
And when it can't be found, it means it couldn't be dualistic because a dualistic thing can be found, but a non-dualistic not thing can't be found. So there's another way that the traditional non-dual teachers will say that if even Zen would say, certain Zen sects will say, seek the seeker and find that it can't be found, but they still think they still go after that which cannot be found as non-dual, and enlightenment would mean the embodiment
Then
of
it
that.
becomes a thing and a cultivation
Yeah,
of a state rather than an ongoing inquiry, which is where the real juice
exactly.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in all those ways, now let's that's the summary in a really concise way of the historical narrative and the congestion in the collective consciousness about it. So you've got to graduate from religionism before you can ever investigate non-religious Eastern esotericism. But
Mm-hmm.
then, but then, in Identity's point of view, you got to complete that circle before you can ever find what really is going on at the root of human consciousness. You've got to reject the conclusions of religion and reject the conclusions of this overarching conditioning that the consciousness has on this planet about non-duality, impersonality, that we don't exist, which is all atheistic. So, in that sense, everything pivots and shakes out into clarity if you redefine the nature of human consciousness as emotive.
Mm-hmm.
If you redefine it that way, then it ceases to become a mental task to transcend mentality.
Right.
That's something
Mm-hmm.
it no longer applies, because remember, it's the mind that creates duality and a false identity out of that duality. And so the definition of the essence of human consciousness by both Descartes in his own way and by the East is that the nature of human consciousness is mentalized
Well, hold on a second.
or physicalized.
The mind creates duality. I don't know if I've ever considered that.
Mhm.
I suppose, yeah, since intrinsically or inherently there's no such thing as a noun.
Right.
So it's sort of like from reality's perspective, there are some things that are more dualistic than others, but there's
Uh-huh.
no actual noun duality because at essence everything is moving and changing and connected, interconnected. So is it really only the human mind that perceives nouns that way?
Well, um, there's a clarity in that, but it's not complete, I would say. So
Okay.
your feeling about this, I think, is exactly accurate, because Gautama would say cathection of the outer dualisms of a rock versus a flower is absorbed by the mind, and then the mind will partition, make nouns out of. They'll see a forest full of trees and say, "Well, there's one tree."
Uh-huh.
They don't won't gestalt the whole forest,
Uh-huh.
and so because they can touch and hug a tree, but they can't hug the whole forest. So
Uh-huh.
that you would Gotama would say outer duality is the parent of the mind's inner duality,
Okay.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, but then as an actional rubber meets the road thing, then the mind then spits out, configures itself in duality, and we experience actually duality as partitional grid work in the mind.
Yeah,
So
that
you
makes
could say it
sense.
from either sense,
And this,
that
that's hence the change in experience of self along the sagehood path. The sense of self, it's like you don't confuse yourself with other people. You don't
that's
lose
right.
all
Yeah,
sense of duality because there's something intrinsic to it, but the
right.
edges soften quite a lot. And you don't have
Yeah.
the same strong sense of self, strong attachment to opinions. It changes.
But it's a really good question track we're on here, because does the mind create duality, or does reality create duality? And it really goes in the pipe either way. But when you're talking about the personal, you can't change the duality of the world. You can only change the way you perceive it.
Right,
And
taking
so,
that too far is what the Advaita Vedanta people say. This is all illusion. You're living in
yeah,
a dream. Now you're into
right,
simulation theory based on distortions of Buddhism.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
your mind's not creating
So
that much of duality, but it is. What is the Buddha line? The difference between you create your world versus you create the world, which is
yes,
perception is
exactly.
reality stuff that goes too far.
Yeah. So, and again, such a look at all the complexity that we're decoding the soaking wet
Yeah,
collective consciousness in the
and
top of the East,
before I
about the East.
forget, notice how it's impossible to talk about Identity's take on sagehood without criticizing other paradigms.
Yeah.
Because if we only talked about Identity's take on sagehood, you wouldn't fully understand it. That's why we have to compare and contrast, because it's very, very subtle. It's like,
Right.
what's the difference between a Macintosh and a delicious apple? Like, well, you got to talk about both in order to talk about one. It
Right.
makes it more descriptive.
Sure. And that can be, as we try to be as passionate as guys as we are, you try to talk about it as neutrally as possible. There's a necessity of contrast to it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so by starting out with, if a paradigm is not, I will say it this way, a la our last podcast,
Mm-hmm.
that identity grew out of saying no to the prevailing paradigms of East and West, but those had to precede identity.
For sure.
Identity could not have existed until those were in place. So everything's real and right depending on what your definition of real is. I would say, identity is both derivative in one way of linked to the past paradigms of spirituality and psychology by saying no to it. But that no is simply in compare and contrast, as you say, and let's test the new theory. A cult says, believe this or else you're out or whatever. But a paradigm says, explore this and see what is true for you. And we're a paradigm, not a cult. A cult would be arrogant, but a paradigm, neutrally investigating, you have to compare and contrast. What's your attachment to your paradigm? Then you become a cult.
Yeah. It's the
That's
relationship.
cultic.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, it always lived in me after my event that my own mind created my former state, not the external dualities, but the duality was the parent. Outer dualities was the parent that I cathected with my brain.
Mm-hmm.
You see how many wrinkles there are to iron out in this whole thing.
Many.
So there's an interesting thing, though, I'd like to mention before I forget it, is that here's a distinction. Joseph, you can correct me on this. I don't think I've ever mentioned this, and you and Eric would know if I've ever said this before, but this came out of Bree's experience. She said that there's a difference in the mechanism of what we call enlightenment, a pre-dual enlightenment, in men and women, yin and yang, not men and women, but
yeah,
you get the application. Men, it's like for men, there's a yogic loss of attachment to the self, as we would say. You lose attachment to the self. But Bree found in helping those 7 women in that time move to the what we would call the pre-dual, they all report. She reports that for yin-based beings, it's not about losing the attachment to the self, but it's about losing the attachment to others.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
I had never thought of that. And Bree and I were talking a couple of months ago, and she said, don't forget that when you talk about non-duality, that for women, it can be different. If they seek it in the old patriarchal way, the loss of self, they're already more transparent, less attached to self by their yinness and more in the collective or the community than men are. So there's a slight difference that it can really arise. And I think out of the 7 women that evented, is that a word? Evented?
Yes.
Five of them experience it as the gradual loss of their attachment to other, not their attachment to self.
Yeah, it's like
So,
it strangely solidified them,
yes.
even though there was an enormous spaciousness in them, but it brought them back to
Yeah.
themselves in a way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So enter Edenity, where if the essence of consciousness is emotive, then the the concept of the practical base of attaining enlightenment is not it is about not transcending duality or even losing yourself in non-duality. It's about healing the terror, the emotional terror of not being. And so that's the algorithm that defines all of the practices in Sagehood that Edenity offers. It's about healing the terror of not being, and that puts everything on a different base to emotively process the slow subtraction of your sense of self or the sense of other, and feel what you're feeling about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that then it becomes a second algorithm to test, and that's what I did after I didn't even try. I was terrified through the months before my event, about a year before, 8, 9 months before. I was terrified by the loss of my being, my personal being. And somebody reflected, well, that's just because you were a 4 in the Enneagram, right? And I said, that's possible, but
Mm-hmm.
if that's my way of processing it, a couple of years later, that same person I ran into, and I said, I reminded this person, you told me the emotive first thing is only came out of someone who was a 4. And I said, I have a question for you, possibility. What if it took a 4 to stumble upon it? You see, and then that person went, whoa, that could be too. He was as generous with that
Well,
as
that's
I was
good.
generous
Yeah,
with his.
of
Yeah,
course.
isn't
I
it?
mean, it's easy to see. It's like Mother Teresa was not an 8; she was a 2.
Yes.
And Abraham Lincoln was a
Yeah.
1 and not a
Yeah.
7. Like there's
Yes.
reasons for these things.
Yeah.
Um, I was going to say something. Yeah, I remember hearing Adyashanti speak about the, I don't know if he called it I'm sure he didn't call it the terror of not being, but just generally speaking about the fear that can come up. And I remember him saying specifically that some people encounter that kind of fear
Yeah.
and some people
Yeah.
don't. And I thought that
Yes.
was really, really telling, because what's really
Yeah.
cool about Edenity's perspective on this is it's not like we invented the idea of the terror of not being and then ask people to go looking for it, in which case they might have fabricated it. There are
Uh-huh.
lots of people who've been on enlightenment paths who have come across it.
Yeah.
And Edenity would say those who find that and emotionally process that are going to have a deeper perhaps, or a more
Yes.
authentic enlightenment, where the ones
Yes.
who don't are probably transcending more.
Yes.
And
And
that's super interesting to me.
absolutely. And as we just prevailed upon the idea, or why are they transcending? And so a transcendence implies directly there's something to transcend out of. And if they say, well, just strict duality, okay, I can live with that. But underneath that, there's always somewhere a semi or unconscious, I don't want to suffer anymore.
Yeah.
So if we're emotional beings first, and again, that base, that's one of the three, one of the tripod, that we're emotional beings before we're willful, mental, and physical. We're testing that. And so far, it yields, just like in the domain of enlightenment, it yields a deeper, more pervasive, less self seductive to guru eyes. It releases some sort of energies that transcendence doesn't, because it has a hidden agenda most of the time. Whereas the agenda of healing the terror of not being is actually consonant, we offer, with the reality that we're emotive beings first.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, where we end up here as our final door to go through here for the Sage track is that where does emotivity is the deepest aspect of our consciousness come from, and that is love. All the great teachers, even Ramana Maharshi, who occasionally use the word Mahatma for the great Mahatma. They will all say that love is inherent to a truly enlightened state. Love, it's always associated, but it's never given first billing. It's an effect. It's an effect of no longer clutching to the noun of self and the noun of self of others, or resisting, clutching or resisting, right? So, but if you listen to where the East can meet the West in a certain way, is that love somehow is an intrinsic part of Eastern and Western. Western really puts it front and center, but the East also has been really uncomfortable where to put that. What love? Where would love arise? Because love doesn't have an edge nounness to it.
It's not dual. It's not dualistic, and it can't be non-dualistic because it has a quality to it. So
correct.
What do they do?
But so it's in between. It falls through the cracks of the esoteric East, and of course, in the esoteric or the exoteric West, you only get love as a reward if you're assume that you're full of shit, and you've got to literally full of shit.
For realizing how unworthy you are of the love, that's how you get it.
Exactly. That's how you get it when you feel totally unworthy of love because you're a bloody sinner. That's when you get love.
Amazing like grace, right? That saved a wretch like me. Yeah.
Yeah, the wretch. Oh, that was the one thing that always turned my stomach. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, we're trying to decode if we're claiming to be a bridge between Eastern and West spirituality, then the bridge is love somehow. So let's just decode that down to the root, and we can complete this. What does that mean? It means that the West gets it right that there is a self-aware divinity within which our consciousnesses, including the physical world, arise. That's where the West says there is a personal God and it's made of love, but you got to earn that love, right? And you earn it by saying you're not worthy of love. Crazy.
Just like a koan.
He said, yeah, and the koan of the West. That's the best koan of the West there is. But the East says, of course, there is no personal God, and it's not made of love. It is simply an impersonal beingness. Where that came from, of course, they have no origin story. At least we try to have an origin story of divine being as best as we can, and that's another interesting story. But in the end, love winds up being the bridge because it's hinted at in the East and misunderstood in the West. So what's the middle ground? And here's the structural algorithm that Edenity bases both its embodiment and its process to get to embodiment on. And that is that which is most essential to all forms of existence is love. We have a term for it. Used to call it ichor, but every year that goes by in Divinity, I keep wanting to say ichoria with an IA at the end instead of ichor. Ichor is kind
a
of
little more feminine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ichoria. It has a melody to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the root being of beingness, of existence itself, love. And love is an emotive dynamic. It's not a mental one. So there's our basis for saying we're emotive first, because we're love first, somewhere way deep in the core of existence. So when you're on the track to enlighten in Edenity's way, you start with that, and that is a love is not dual, and it's not non-dual. It's pre-dual.
Uh-huh.
Duality arises somehow out of a universal love with and as everything. Divinity itself is made of ichoria, and it has a universal regard of love toward everything that exists. It's universal. So you start with ichoria, which is a universal love basis that's pre-dual. So now we're on the track. Okay, we've linked that to the pre-dual, because it's not dual and it's not non-dual. It's got quality, like you said. Now comes the next form of it. Pre-duality, or pre-dual is not the opposite of dual. It's a stage previous to dual. And what happens between pre-duality and duality is what we call unality. And that is where there is a personal love of divinity for, with, and as all of its creation. So you've got
unality is prior to pre-duality?
You could say that there's a unality in the universal love for divine being for all of its souls equally.
Uh-huh.
Then you've got pre-duality. Now there's a unality, a second unality that involves the personal love for each and every
universal love and
kind
personal love both come out of unality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got ichoria, universal love as its first form. Then that's all pre-dual. Now the second, that's its essence. Then it goes to form, to universal, and then to personal. And that the personal love for all of its individualized creation. It loves all flowers equally, and it finds a way, because it's divine being, to love that one at the same time it loves everything. Mm-hmm. We'll come back to the importance of this. And then finally we have duality. So it's a whole unfolding of love getting form and expression in universal and personal ways. And the key is that personal unality, because what we call, and here's what all of this leads up to, what the traditions have called non-duality, is simply the unal love of the personal, of the birth of soul that comes out of divinity. In other words, it's the capacity of love that precedes the birthing of a soul, whether it's the soul of flowers, which are more collective, or the soul of self-aware beings who know they're self-aware. There's a love intentionality to that. Mm-hmm. And we use the metaphor that not what's been called the non-dual all this time is simply the womb space of the inside of divinity that within which, that preceded your seeding of soul and the love, the unality love it has for it. So it's like when you enlighten, you're actually enlightening, and here's the bridge between East and West, you're enlightening to the love intention that preceded your individual birth of soul. But that precedes your existence. But to the root, clinging to the roots of our most primal first version of our soul being born was the intention, the unality, personal love of divine being to birth your soul. And that's what links the non-dual emptiness. A womb is empty until it is filled with a little being that starts growing. It has to be empty before the seed can be planted within it. It has to have a space. And it's that space that they've been calling the non-dual all these centuries. It's divine being's womb and its yin and yin divinity. And so here we have then a way to link. It can be, I've heard someone call that pejorative, but it's an investigation. What if it's true that what we've been calling non-dual all this time is simply the empty, previous empty womb of divine being from which your soul birth arose, imbued with love, and it's empty, non-dual. It's not, you have your birth, your soul hasn't been born yet, but somehow on the root of your soul, it's still clinging to the roots, and you can pull that along with you.
It's the moment where something comes out of everything, in a way.
Yes.
Not nothing.
Oh, nice.
But everything.
Not nothing, everything. Oh, nicely put. It's that moment, and it's all in us. And that's why even souls in the pure non-dual tradition will somehow feel this love thing. And this structure that I just described, Edenity offers for investigation, is the reason why love, instead of being in the background, though, or as an effect, is actually the cause for the birth of individual consciousness.
And this is a very important metaphysical premise, because I've not heard or read a compelling explanation for why is it when you connect to that which is behind all dualistic things is there's this sense of love, like we were saying, like kind of an important question. If non-duality is supposed to have no permanent features,
no qualities
whatsoever,
right.
And yet here's a fairly reliable experience. So why is that? And so when non-dual paradigms chalk that up to mystery, it's an error in their own metaphysics. Really, they're not admitting how their model doesn't explain the experience. Kind of a big deal.
A really good point, Joseph. And we're not criticizing it as much as it simply was an evolution that wasn't time yet to happen. And Edenity, by saying no and offering a decode to that which falls through the cracks of the paradigm's teaching, that's evolution.
And our paradigm says that we like models that explain the most phenomena with the least contradictions. If you don't agree with that, and you don't care that your model doesn't explain as many things, that's cool, but that's just where we're coming from. And like that would that's also, I think, just life would be better if people examined how well their models were describing reality in a rigorous way. That's what science does, or at least they state it as an intention.
And then over attached to their to their orientation. Sure.
It's like I always quote how it's usually related to the age of psychology, but without that desire to explain more phenomenon, we would still think everything was made of earth, fire, air, and water, because
that's right.
In 400 or 500 BC, that was the most compelling explanation of the nature of matter they had. And when it couldn't explain stuff, they came up with something better, and so on. So that's, I think it's important. I'm asserting that value for consideration.
Sure. That's a great
damn model.
Right. Oh, no, but you can't update or at least in the West, you can't update the religious model, or else you're a blasphemer, right?
Yes, no, because the book that God wrote is absolute truth for all time, and Muhammad was the last prophet. Somehow they knew that too, right?
Yeah, that's right, the last prophet. So to tie it all together and complete, there's another dimension to add to this whole offering, and that is that it's going on 13 years. In December will be 13 years
Oh,
since yin
wow.
divinity
I didn't realize
has
that. Yeah.
has been soaking in. And the more it soaks in, the more it renders obsolete the Eastern version of enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I would offer that the every year that yin divinity deepens its effect in our world, the less able people can have the kind of scorched earth enlightenment that I had. Yin divinity brings things together, doesn't cleave them where there's an either or.
Mm-hmm.
Its whole dynamic is
Because
and.
transcendence is yang.
Yes,
It's an either
completely,
or. Yeah.
completely. And
It's
it's
willful.
exclusivational also the
Mm-hmm.
standard non-dual model because it's either a self that's real or the self that's not real or it's an illusion. It's
Right.
exclusional,
Yeah.
and that's why the track of esoteric East it was incepted and cultivated uh, and curated in a yang divine context.
Mm-hmm.
And now that yin divinity is making its mark known with andness and not either orness, inclusivational, it's rendering that whole track obsolete. I think in 50 more years, you just won't have people enlightening in the old traditional way. So someone might ask, what is the new way? And oh, baby, I got something that I haven't said before, and I'm proud to do it in Joseph's magnificent company on his podcast. A new thing that has not been said yet in the
Mm-hmm.
teaching of Edenity.
Drum roll, please.
Yes, I'm excited. I'm a little nervous too. But it's
This is a safe space.
yeah. Thank you. Oh God, yeah. Well, or someone could say we're just co-signing each other's illusory importance,
Yeah.
But
Right.
anyway, that's fine too. What's going to happen now in the future of enlightenment is going to be not non-dual or even pre-dual. It's going to be a combination of love and no longer attaching to the yang based thing we call mind. Mind is and will are yang based. So, how is this going to evolve with an and based yin divinity? Well, it came to me the other day. I was sitting, what do we have to offer now as the yin divinity keeps deepening its presence in this domain of sage? And the answer is instead of looking for pre thought or pre dual, we're going to base a dharma in trying to sense free will.
Uh-huh.
Free will. And to that, my scientist inside said, well, how will that wind up affecting a version of non-dual access? And the answer is since will is one step more senior to mind and its duality, even though there's my will versus your will, that's true, but it's a deeper version. If you can get under the lip the manhole cover of will, cultivate a meditation on what precedes my will, not just my mind and the way it cuts up things, you will automatically get divine presence, love. Love is the only thing senior to will. And the whole thing of love versus will being the essential nature of God, which we have our whole narration, a whole origin story. But since will is one step deeper than mind, when you go pre-will and successful with it, you will automatically undermine mind.
Mm-hmm.
Automatically, because it's like taking out the foundation of a house and then the house falls down.
Mm-hmm.
So pre-will as a way to both access divine being and no longer be a slave to duality will occur, in my opinion, as a good dharma to start curating, which I don't have all the steps yet, how to do that.
Wouldn't you have
But
to do a
this,
whole lot of EBE first because the will is so much utilized by the protector?
that's an assumption.
Yeah.
You can't have, we're looking for what's previous to healthy will, mature will, emotively mature will. That's a structure, not just an application or a form or an expression, like our protections form is. So you've got to be healed enough of your protections will to be able to get at the root basic. What's your healthy will? What's before healthy will in
Yeah,
our own
because
paradigm?
unhealthy will won't care what's before it and won't let you look
No,
there.
no, it's impossible. You won't be able to get under it.
Yeah.
It's welded to
Yeah.
itself
Yeah.
but
Out of
paradoxically,
love.
out of
Yeah.
love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even the protection uses love
Yeah.
to keep out love,
And that's
to
how
keep out
you
the
get it to
vulnerability.
relax, by loving it, by helping it
Yes,
see how
exactly.
its negative behaviors are the result of positive intentions in essence. Yeah.
Yeah. So look how the whole possible algorithm of moving toward pre-healthy structural willfulness comes out of already considering what's pre-dual rather than trans-dual or meta-dual. You see, and so pre-dual creates a bridge between East and West with its spaciousness, and driving a car across that bridge is what give us what pre-will enlightenment, enheartenment, Edenity will provide us with an automatic. So we won't have to separate the tracks. A one emotive track will unify
Okay.
enlightenment and spirit and divine spirituality.
My mind, I don't know, my mind or my soul, something's starting to turn in me about this. It makes sense because it's like I'm starting to think, okay, like how would you get to that which is pre-will? And thinking about so many of the Dharma practices are about getting pre-mind. But if you've done a lot of EBE, then there
Yes,
isn't the welded unhealthy will thing.
yes, right.
So you could use some of the same practices as getting pre-mind and just be aiming for pre-will,
Yes,
and it would
yes,
probably work.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm looking for any and all ideas on how to algorithmize that pre-will track. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but first you have to plant the possibility of the algorithm, and then we'll develop the Dharma. But this is what I came out of a dead sleep,
Mm-hmm.
straight up in bed like this about 2 weeks ago. What's yin divinities in the now? We're never going back to yang divinity as far as whatever goes. At least there'll be a sharing in some maybe huge long future. But how does that affect everything as it deepens? I went to sleep thinking about that.
Hmm.
What is it? What's the future going to be? And then I woke up in the middle of the night, just right out of a dead sleep.
Hmm.
Pre-will, and that now is an investigative path to build a dharma on, with some similar stuff, but not the same.
Well,
And it'll all be emotive,
I
much
wonder
more
if that
emotive.
night, I think it was about 10 days ago for me. I wonder if it was the same night. We haven't been talking about this, about Sagehood at all, other than we had a
Right,
vague intention with the revisiting the
right.
series. But I
Mhm.
was going to sleep. I was in a difficult, as you know, it's dealing with a lot of existential kind of anger and angst and stuff. And that night, I kind of saw like, okay, I don't think I've been turning toward this enough. I've been not letting
Okay.
myself feel it enough. So beginning tomorrow, I'm going to really start taking some time because I know with existential stuff, you have to just let yourself become it. And there's this phase where you try to differentiate and negotiate with it and it doesn't work. And I'd sort of failed, I dead ended that. And so I
Mhm.
found this resolve of like, okay, I'm going to the collapse of will resolve. It's really the not a surrender, not a resolve,
No, well, I
but
get
a
it. Yeah.
resolveful surrender or a surrendering resolve. And it was like, okay, I sort of give up, and beginning tomorrow, I'm going to really let myself feel this more. And I was trying to go to sleep, And completely unbidden, the koan came to me, the cliche koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping, came to me. And then I felt this like breeze through my soul, and I felt the presence of yin divinity, and an answer arose. And I don't want to say the answer on air, because from what I know about koans, you're not supposed to tell people answers because it will ruin the koan for them. But I knew it was maybe not the answer, but I knew it was an answer. And it was the only koan answer I'd ever really, I just knew it. Like, that's what it was.
So a new arising, in other words, something new.
Yeah, it was.
Arose.
And it just, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just trying to relax and go to sleep. And a koan came, and I was like, that's interesting. Like, why am I thinking about that? And then the answer came, and I felt it. And it seemed to indicate that sagehood, there's some sage thing that I needed to be doing. And I've been feeling more and more curious about that. So I don't know if that fits with this arising thing right now, because it's just something I'm exploring, a sort of openness to it, and feeling the call of not having completed my awakening path.
I think you're right on this, dating myself with right on.
Right course. On, man.
But it was right around that time, 10, 12 days
certainly
ago.
Within a few days, yeah.
Yeah. So linked to the pre-will thing also came something that our dharma for personhood hasn't yet been aware was there all the time. And that I don't want to say on air. I want to bring it to our collegial setting to offer what's been missing in a personal processing way that was there all the time. It was in the paradigm, but it wasn't unfolded yet. And that came after this pre-will thing. So
it makes sense.
There's some updating happening here in all three hoods, that as we approach the 13th anniversary of Yin Divinity. So it's exciting. And to have a new, Joseph, what you're saying, we can talk about not on camera, is so for that reason, I love what you're not doing that at the moment. There's so much resonance between what you got and what these two versions of pre-will and a new personhood unfolding.
And very exciting. And what I didn't say was the next morning, that existential angst that I was dealing with was gone. It was just complete. I was all ready for it. And it was just, it had been aerated. It seems to have come back a little bit, but it's not like it was before. It was like, this kind of sagely grace that was like, you're looking for, I remember to use the Ajya thing. I was looking frustratedly looking for a needle in the haystack. And then it was like, no, it's the haystack. And it was like, oh
nice.
And everything changed, and suddenly it wasn't so angsty. And so the all that angst is still there, but it's like I'm not in the middle of it. I'm not itchily in the haystack. I'm standing outside going, what are we going to do about that haystack? Like, I think I'll go have a drink and think about it. Like, I'm not inside the itchy haystack anymore.
That's so good. Yeah. So let's end this podcast or go to close with a really important thing that comes out of this final segment of our conversation, that a real paradigm that's authentically resonant with actually how consciousness in the world works. That's what we're all been looking for since Socrates, since the first caveman said, "Where does my itch in my butt come from?" Which
first
is
words ever spoken. You heard it here.
Oh, man, absolutely right. A paradigm evolves, and all we can say is that the evolution of a paradigm that purports to be and testing to be always resonant with offering the best, most explanation with the least contradiction, as you so beautifully said, is unfolding. Identity is unfolding, and what it's unfolding, and what I just referred to here in sage sainthood and in personhood, is consonant with the paradigm, but it was unfolded as of yet. And until the paradigm can offer dharmas associated with a new unfolding, um, uh, you can't embody it. Uh, what is that again? 1 second. There you go. I don't know. Something that comes in once in a while.
Okay.
An old recording of something. So the paradigm of identity evolves, and if it ever evolved to a place that contradicted the basic three presence, the tripod points, that's when we know we've completed identity, and we need to find a new, more inclusive one. So we're just trying
Yeah,
to.
like what
I've
happened
been
with
trying.
Newtonian physics, right? They had to create
Yeah,
quantum physics.
exactly. Same, but it's still in the scientific zone, right?
Yeah.
Same principle here. So we're just so in terms of undermining one more dimension of arrogance, we're trying to dead end identity all the time. We're open, not trying actively, but experimenting to see if it will dead end, and that dimension of it makes it consonant with the flow of actual existence. Nothing stops, but it keeps going deeper and more whole. And here's a paradigm that is like a lens that focuses the parameters of that possible deeper wholeness
Yeah.
in all of us.
And it's very difficult to teach that spirit of dead ending. And it seems to be a function of just soul age. Like when you've been
Yes.
around a
Yeah.
lot, you just have this kind of inherent impatience, and you want to milk everything, like get everything you can out of it, and either it works or you're on to the next thing. And I remember as I was 21 or 22, and my mother told me that a friend of mine said to her about me that I was in a constant state of experimentation. Like it was a bad thing, kind of. That was sort of the connotation, like lost,
I
like
believe it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'll never forget that because I was like, it was like feeling seen a little bit, but mostly not at all. Like, oh, that's what it looks like from your perspective. But what I see from my perspective is you all are way too satisfied with shit that isn't working for you. That's how it looks from over here.
That's great words.
And I get that that's what it looks like, but like scientists experiment to come up with better things, and I'm just not satisfied. I'm overjoyed that you're satisfied. I kind of don't think you should be, but hey, none of my business.
Like right. You know how to be you. You don't know how to. I don't know how to be you, but you know how to be you. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, but it was really interesting to. I never forgot that because I saw myself in a way like, oh, you know when you're young, like at least for me, I didn't realize how different I was from most people until my late 20s. I thought everybody was dealing with a lot of the same stuff. That's why I was so pissed at them.
Me too. Same. Absolutely. Same for me. Exactly.
And then I learned about the Enneagram. That was one of my first ahas. Like, oh, I thought everybody processed reality like I did, and they just weren't being forthcoming about it or something.
Oh, God. Yeah. The image just came to me out of what you just shared there about the experimentation thing is one way to abstract an Edenist is we're a rolling stone that simultaneously sheds moss and gathers moss because we're constantly updating the embodiment of love first, will second, mental third, and physical fourth. And in that sense, we're always shedding to make room for new moss to gather, which then in the roll down the hill, eternal roll down the hill, the soul will experiment with that which sticks to it resonantly and effortlessly, and that which doesn't. And so that is holy to me. What she inferred, or this person inferred, was, well, are you ever going to land anywhere?
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing. There, with my friend, there was an appreciation of it, but also a little bit of cynicism. And then my mother interpreted it in the way she would, in a disdainful, critical. Because her thing is, why can't you just be happy? I just want you to be happy. Parentheses, so I can feel successful and not guilty as a mother. Right? Oh, it's really about her.
That parenthetical phrase just described everything that parents don't know how to be for their children.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, Joseph. All right. So we conclude our diatribe offering on Eastern esotericism, and next time we're going to talk about id entity a
Id
bit
entity.
more.
I'll never look at that word the same way. It looks like a
Uh,
monster now, an id entity.
it did. I remember that came to me once in a satsang. Don't forget, it just came right out of my mouth, unmindful. Identity is an id entity. It's Freud. We can connect to Freud here. It's not good thing. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay, so tune in next time. That'll be 97. And yeah, getting close to that 100 mark. I still have that bottle of wine in the fridge.
Well, it turns out that 100 may be on or around December 21st, 2024, which would be the 13th anniversary of.
No, it'll be sooner than that. So we'll be
You think?
recording that in September or early October.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm getting. Don't ask me about tracking time.
Maybe
these
it'd be
days.
like 108 though, because that's a cool number.
Oh, okay. Well, that'd be a cool number.
Yeah.
Okay.
108 would probably be around December.
All right, sir.
Thank you, Stace.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
listeners. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Yes. If you didn't exist, this podcast wouldn't exist. I feel like a guest on it always.
I am
so
existentially a priori to this podcast. Yes.
Oh,
That's how it feels.
babe.
That's how I can edit it. If I were downstream, it would be editing me.
Okay, you just spun my cognitive machine there for a moment. Boy, do I get that. I can feel that, but I can't understand it. But you're exactly right. Wow, that's great, Joseph. Anyway,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, listeners. Until next time. Bye for now.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.